this lesson we're going to be taking a look at Mendelian genetics. It seems like a good place to start looking at genetics because this is sort of where genetics all started. So this is what we're going to take a look at. We're going to take a look at Mendel, his experiments, his life, and what he did. For a long time before Mendel, humans have sort of been asking the question, why do we look the way we look? How did we get the way how did we become the way we became? Why do you sort of look like a mix of your parents, but not really? Why do you have some traits like everybody says I have my dad's nose, so that's where that came from. But why do they say that? But why do I have my dad's nose and my mom's eyes? And why am I sort of a mix of the two, but not really? So we've been asking that question for a long time, for probably as long as humans have been around, trying to figure out how we get the traits that we got. Well, along came Mendel, and Mendel wanted to solve this problem. So that's sort of where we're going. Before Mendel, we had a theory that went sort of like this. If we took a red flower and a white flower and we bred them together, now I know they're two different breeds of flowers, but just for the sake of understanding the idea, this is what happened. So if we took a red flower and a white flower, before Mendel, sort of the general theme or the general idea was that if we bred these two flowers together, we would end up with a purple flower or a pink flower. So somewhere in between. It would be like mixing paint, where if we took red and white paint and we swirled it together, we would get pink paint to come out. This is what was called the blending theory of inheritance. So we believe that traits blended, that if a really tall person made a child with a really short person, their child would be somewhere in between. This is sort of the prominent theory before Mendel. Well, Mendel wanted to tackle this. He wanted to see if this is actually the way it worked. If traits actually blended together to get the offspring, or if something else was going on in this experiment. So that's where Mendel started off. He wanted to either prove or disprove blending theory. A little bit about Mendel. If we take a look at Mendel's life here. Here's a good picture of Mendel. Mendel was an Austrian monk. This is his monastery over here. This is actually his garden that he tended. Looks a little different today than it did when he was here. And here's a statue down here in his garden. Well, Mendel was an Austrian monk, and he had the job of tending to the garden. That was his job. He was the gardener there, and so he tended to the garden. But Mendel was kind of an unusual figure. He had a degree in math and statistics. So he was a very learned person, had his degree in math and statistics. And he used his spare time and his garden to really attack this problem of the blending theory of inheritance. Now, monks, they had a lot of spare time on their hands, so this was a great task for Mendel to push on and try to achieve. So here's what Mendel did. Mendel used what was in front of him, and it made sense. And so Mendel used, for his subjects, he used the garden pea plant. And he used the garden pea plant for a couple of really good reasons. One, it grew fast. It grew really quickly. Two, it was widely available. He had it available in his garden. He could do research on it fairly quickly. And then the other one is it had some characteristics that were easily observable. Some things about the flower that made it easy to observe, and we'll look at those characteristics in a bit. Another reason why Mendel decided to look at pea plants was because he could manipulate how they bred really easily. And that had to do with their flowers and their flower structure or flower anatomy. So if we take a look at flower anatomy here, this is probably a review for some of you, but over here we see the male structure of the plant, and that's right here. It's the stamen, and it's got the top part here called the anther, and then the stick coming off of it called the filament. The stamen produces pollen. And that pollen can travel to other flowers, or it can self-pollinate its own flower. So that pollen can actually land on the female structure of the plant, which is in the middle here, and that's called the carpel. And it's got a top part here called the stigma, which is sticky, which collects the pollen. And then it's got this tube called the style, and down here it's got this ovary, and you can see a zoom in of the ovary over here, and we see ovules down here. So that's sort of the structure of the flower. Well, the nice thing about this is Mendel could control it. If he didn't want the flower to pollinate itself, he could cut off the male structures, and then that flower wouldn't make pollen. Or if he wanted to make sure that flower only pollinated with itself, he could sew up the leaves or attach the leaves together, and that way only the pollen from that flower was able to get at the carpel of the female, or the female structure of that flower. This is Mendel's experiment. So if we're going to take a look at what Mendel did with these pea plants, here's what he did. I told you that these pea plants have 7 characteristics that make them really good for doing genetic research, because they have 7 things that they are very easily observable. For instance, the seed form, like it can either be gray or round and white and wrinkled. The cotyledons can either be yellow or green. The flower can either be white or violet. The pods can either be full or constricted, or yellow and green, or they can be long and short size, or they can have terminal or axial flowers. So it has 7 easily observable characteristics that we can take a look at and make sense of. And so that was one reason why the pea plant was really good, is those are the characteristics that Mendel's going to look at. So here's what he did. He took what he called the pea generation, and these are pure breeding flowers. Pure breeding, which means no matter how many times he bred them, they only produce that color of flower. So he took pure breeding violet flowers, and he's going to cross those with pure breeding white flowers. So he's going to see if they actually do blend. Now, if they blend, we should get sort of somewhere in between, like a light violet flower. Well, Mendel did this, and he got what he called the F1, and F stands for filio, or child. And the F1 generation, he found that he got only violet flowers, that the white flowers completely and totally disappeared. And then he did something weird. So he didn't just look at this and say, well, blending's not true. He wanted to see what was going on here to try to solve the puzzle. So he took these 2 F1 generation plants and he bred them together. And he realized that when he bred these 2 F1 generation plants, he got this weird thing that happened. He got a 3-to-1 ratio, where he saw 3 violet plants produced, and you see these by the upper 3 boxes, and he got 1 white flower. So he found a 3-to-1 ratio in these plants every time he did this, no matter what characteristic, whether he's looking at flower color or wrinkled seeds or yellow or green seeds, no matter what he looked at, he found this 3-to-1 ratio. What Mendel discovered from this is this. Here's what he came up with, and this is genius. He used his math, his statistics to take careful records and come up with some really astonishing results that we still use today in genetics. So he determined that there are 2 factors for every trait. So if he's looking at the gene for flower color, there are 2 pieces of information for each gene. He determined that one of them they can come in 2 forms, either dominant or recessive. The dominant form is able to mask the recessive form, and the recessive only shows up if there's no dominant. So there's 2 factors. The factors can either be dominant or recessive, and depending upon your combination, that's what your appearance is. So if we take a look at this, if we take a look, these are 2 homologous chromosomes. So these are 2 maybe chromosome number 1s. And then on here we realize that here's the gene for flower color, right down here, these bands. And we realize that this would be the allele for white flowers, and this could be the allele for purple flowers. So this one would be dominant, this one would be recessive. So these alleles are located on different chromosomes. Now Mendel didn't know that, but we know that now today. So those are Mendel's results. He came up with the idea that there are 2 factors, 1 dominant and 1 recessive. And along with that, he came up with 2 rules, and we'll kind of work with these a little more in class. They're a little confusing. So the first rule is Mendel's law of segregation. Mendel said that these 2 pieces of information that we looked at back here, these 2 alleles, they segregate, they move away from each other when we make egg and sperm. So what that means is this. I'm going to find my pen tool here. Okay, so if we have if our 2 genes are big A, little a, when we make egg cells or sperm cells, so when we go through meiosis, we're only ever going to give 1 piece of information to our offspring. So our offspring only gets half of our alleles, 1 of each gene. So we can either give our child 1 big A or one little a. We can never give them both. That's Mendel's first law. Mendel's second law is his law of independent assortment. And here's what it says. It says that genes are not connected. Now, Mendel was mostly right with this. There are some exceptions to this rule, and we'll talk about those in class. But here's what it says. So the gene for flower color, or if we look at this, here's what we have. The gene for yellow seeds or green seeds, and the gene for green pods or yellow pods. If we look at that, these genes are not connected. It does not matter if you have green seeds. That's not going to automatically give you yellow pods. They're independent of each other. These two genes are not connected in any way. It's like saying this in humans. If I have connected earlobes, that doesn't automatically make me 8 feet tall. They're not connected. You can have connected earlobes and you can be tall, or you can have connected earlobes and be short. The two genes are independent of each other. So those are Mendel's two laws that he came up with, and the idea of two factors. So we'll stop there for today. If you have any questions about this, let me know. Feel free to ask me questions in class. Thanks, team.